The best of money matters. The big story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Southeast Asian leaders are gathered in Kuala Lumpur for the 46th ASEAN Summit. Themed inclusivity and sustainability, the summit comes at a time of heightened geopolitical tensions and economic uncertainties. Regional leaders expected to discuss ways to strengthen ASEAN's unity and resilience. The main summit took place a day ago, but today the regional bloc will hold its first trilateral summit with the Gulf Cooperation Council and China. So what tangible results can we expect from this year's summit? Well, joining us today to share more is Dr. Oh Sun, who is the Principal Advisor at the Pacific Research Center of Malaysia and Senior Fellow of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Oh, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Dr. Oh, we've just concluded day one of the 46th ASEAN Summit yesterday. What is the main focus of this year's summit, though? Can you give us a better sense of the integral areas that the bloc is looking to touch on?
Well, of course, this year is Malaysia's rotating chairmanship for ASEAN, and the main theme, so-called inclusivity and sustainability. So yesterday, the leaders adopted the Kuala Lumpur Declaration, which is supposed to propel ASEAN into the next 2 decades until 2045. Of course, you saw some of the reviews of ASEAN's achievements thus far, and the leaders, they are particularly concerned that ASEAN Economic Community, which is supposed to bring all of us into a common market, a common production base, and in a sense, a free trade area, that has yet to be fully implemented. So there are some calls for concrete implementation of this ASEAN Economic Community, and of course various other programs and projects which relate to sustainable developments. For example, the call for ASEAN to have a common power grid so that our electricity generated could be transmitted to one another and so on. So overall, it's a very forward-looking summit as well as declaration. But of course, as they say, the devil are in the details and in the implementations. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Malaysia Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim wants ASEAN to be a conduit between China and the Gulf. But realistically, how does the region have enough diplomatic clout to play, middleman between the two giants?
Well, number one, we are amidst of very turbulent world nowadays, both economically as well as geopolitically. Number two, ASEAN does have some clout because, it is the world's fourth largest economy if you take us as a whole, and it's probably the world's fastest growing region. And although China and the Gulf countries are not strangers to one another, but ASEAN can play, in a sense, somewhat of a matchmaking role because we know both of them separately quite well. We have some ASEAN countries which are Muslim majority. On the other hand, we are also having China as our major or number one trading partners. So how could we synergize this into, for example, as this year's theme would suggest, to be more inclusive of all these big regional players? I think that's what we are trying to achieve. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the Malaysian Prime Minister also spoke about ASEAN's strategic clarity. So what does this mean when member states seem to be heading in different directions, geopolitically?
Well, indeed, ASEAN, at least to me, is sometimes situated in a very ironic position. On the one hand, we respect each other's sovereignty very well. We don't interfere in the internal affairs of each of these members. And because of that, we are considered a rather loose regional organizations, not very cohesive and so on. But on the other hand, it's precisely this lack of cohesion which makes us so enduring. We are not willing to give up our respective sovereignty, but on the other hand, this is a part of the world which has not seen any wars or armed conflicts for the last half a century. So that's why we are trying to preserve this sort of very delicate balance.
Well, Dr. O, speaking of the bloc here, Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, they are being floated as new members. But with ASEAN already split on Myanmar and the South China Sea, is now really the time to widen the tent?
Well, Timor-Leste, it's likely to be admitted in the next ASEAN Summit, which is the end of the year, probably November. As to Papua New Guinea, of course, Indonesia mooted the idea, quite lofty of them, because Indonesia, is a neighbor of Papua New Guinea. But I think that would go through a rather long process. We are not in a hurry, with the exception of Timor-Leste, to admit new members. And indeed, as you suggested, we are still yet to resolve the Myanmar crisis.
Right. Elsewhere, Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. says he's optimistic about finalizing a South China Sea Code of Conduct. Well, Dr. O, what has changed? Has there been any real movements on the South China Sea after 20 years of stalled talks and fresh maritime clashes?
Well, very frankly speaking, it's like a tango, right? You move forward one step and then back two steps, right? Of course, every ASEAN summit would call upon the ASEAN members and China and other countries to adopt code of conduct on South China Sea. But of course, to be blunt about it, every country would like to see the code being enforced against other disputants, but not against themselves. So therein, I think, lies the difficulties in reaching to such a code of conduct.
Well, the Filipino president has even called on leaders to fast-track the code of conduct, but analysts believe the agreement is more likely a decade away. What are your views, Dr. O? What still needs to be done to finalize the conduct?
I rather agree with the analysts that it's still a long time away from the code of conduct being concluded. I think what it takes, frankly speaking, is political will as well as confidence building. All these countries which are in disputes over some parts of South China Sea, sometimes, frankly speaking, they might not trust each other very well. If we are talking about some sort of common explorations for all these famed mineral resources on South China Sea, well, then perhaps we should roll out some pilot projects, right? I could imagine, for example, China has a technology, and then sometimes some of these other disputants, they could work together in order to explore some of these minerals and then share the proceeds.
Now, Dr. O, also taking a look at the Myanmar crisis here, the informal advisory group on Myanmar is being hailed as a breakthrough. Has there been any change in the military's posture? Why hasn't ASEAN moved the needle on the Myanmar crisis?
Well, the Myanmar junta, which is ruling the country, they are, shall we say, a little bit more willing in engaging with ASEAN as a whole. But frankly speaking, we still don't see a lot of progress on the Myanmar front. For example, ASEAN representatives still don't gain access to the main opposition leaders who are incarcerated and so on. So I think it would be a repetition from Myanmar's positions, let's say 2 decades ago, when they sort of slow march themselves into some form of democratization before too long, hopefully.
Okay, then how will it function differently from previous initiatives, and what metrics will ASEAN use to determine whether it's, succeeding in advancing peace?
Well, ASEAN, as I mentioned, is a rather loose organization. Well, when we define peace, mainly we are talking about ASEAN members not engaging in warfare with one another. On that front, we are quite successful. Myanmar crisis, for example, even though internally, frankly speaking, it is not doing very well, but at least Myanmar, it's not, in armed conflicts with its neighbors. So we are usually talking about the maintenance of peace in that sense.
Right. Well, meanwhile, trade tariff is a hot topic at the summit as well, Dr. O. Ahead of the ASEAN Summit, Malaysian FM had called for regional action on U.S. tariffs. How is the issue of U.S. tariffs being addressed in current summit talks?
Well, I think there are some polite mentionings that it's regrettable that, perhaps we should have more free trade and so on. But frankly speaking, even though Malaysia is pushing very hard for somewhat of a so-called common ASEAN stance on the tariff issues, but the cold, harsh fact remains that many ASEAN countries, they approach the United States bilaterally, and they prefer that kind of bilateral negotiations. Yeah.
Oh, so is it unlikely that the ASEAN will adopt a unified position in response to the U.S. tariffs?
I don't think there will be such a unified positions because different ASEAN countries, they are at different developmental stages and there are different issues of contention as far as trade with U.S. is concerned. Yeah.
Okay. Well, at the same time, Prime Minister and Minister for Finance Lawrence Wong called for ASEAN to be 100% tariff-free within its free trade area. So, Dr. Oh, do you think this is doable? What do you think might be the obstacles preventing ASEAN from achieving this goal right now?
Well, number one, I think Prime Minister Wong's call is a very timely one amidst sort of rise of protectionism and unilateralism around the world. If we are to, well, as we discussed, try to forge a common stance on tariff and so on, well, then by definition, we should harmonize the tariffs within ourselves, right? I mean, we should make sure that the tariffs are at least reduced, if not removed completely, as is called by Prime Minister Wong. What I worry is, of course, let's say we reduce all our tariffs to zero against one another within ASEAN, but at the same time, we might raise these so-called non-tariff barriers. We might make it more difficult for agricultural products to go from one country to another, for example. So if we were to really do this well, we have to remove or at least reduce both tariffs as well as non-tariff barriers here.
Now, the upcoming ASEAN-China GCC Trilateral Summit looks ambitious here. Do you see this summit as the beginning of a new economic or geopolitical bloc led by the Global South?
Well, at this point, I think it's a start, and then probably in the next summit, they are going to sort of roll out some sort of a roadmap towards some sort of a free trade agreement among ASEAN, the GCC, and China. And if that comes into being, it will be one of the largest free trade areas in the world.
Will this further strengthen China's ties with the ASEAN bloc, Dr. Oh, and what will this mean for U.S. relations?
Well, China's ties, and especially economic ties with Southeast Asia, is already very strong. It is the number one trading partner with each and every ASEAN country. But of course, as we saw in recent years, China's own economy, it's also slowing down, right? So how much longer can it maintain this sort of momentum in terms of both trade and investments, and especially with Southeast Asia? I think that remains to be seen. That is why China is also very anxious to sort of forge this kind of new synergy, not only with ASEAN, but with the GCC. And let's see, together, all three of these major economies would be able to do something here.
Well, Dr. Oh, the two-day summit ends today. So what key developments or outcomes should we be watching following this summit? Are there any other specific agreements, investments, or follow-up actions we should keep an eye on?
Well, I think the leaders voiced concerns about, I mentioned, the lack of implementation about this ASEAN Economic Community, and that is very much in line of what PM Lawrence Wong has said, that, well, take a bold step. Let's reduce our tariffs or remove them altogether, right? Well, that would be one significant step, but making sure that the existing, all these free trade arrangements are really implemented at the national levels. I think that is also one of the key points that was mentioned in this summit. Yeah.
Some great insights from you there. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Oh, for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. That was Dr. Oi's son, who is a principal advisor at the Pacific Research Center of Malaysia and senior fellow of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.